Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you today. I'd like to start off by recognizing that the project that I'm going to be presenting today and the information I'm being presenting today was sponsored by the Arkansas Soybean Promotion Board. And we've learned a lot through this project, and there's still a lot yet to learn. But I think it's been a very interesting project and given us a unique opportunity to see what's going on at Mr. Culler's farm and see if we can implement this in some of our own research too. Like Jeremy indicated, the Kip Cullers has kind of changed the whole game for us. And this is in 2008, I believe. In 2006, Mr. Cullers shocked everyone with 139 bushel per acre yield. He came back 2007 and said that wasn't good enough and had 155 bushel per acre yield. 2008, he dropped down a little bit, 118 bushel per acre yield. 2009, he had severe disease problems on his farm and didn't actually cut his contest field for the yield contest. But 2010, he came back with a vengeance, 160.6 bushel per acre yield. So this is really way over the top for any kind of yields that anyone else had ever been able to achieve before. The previous yield record was set in the mid-1980s in small plot research at Rutgers University by a guy named Dr. Roy Flannery. Dr. Flannery, and I'll discuss this a little bit later, actually used a lot of the same kind of principles that Kip Cullers implements now on his farm, and we'll look at that in just a little bit. This morning what I want to do is look at first just kind of a framework for what soybean yield actually is due to, how soybean yield comes about, what are those resources that crops need to produce yield. We'll look at a description of Mr. Culler's production system and some key things that we think go into this production system that are responsible for these high yields. We'll look at a little crop modeling exercise where we try to piece apart these different parts of the production system using a very simple but effective crop simulation model and what it can tell us about the production system at Mr. Culler's farm. And then finally, we'll look at some maximum yield research that the University of Arkansas has conducted and trying to emulate some of these practices from Mr. Culler's farm. So just first, let's look at some of the resources that crops need to achieve these high yields, any kind of yield actually. And I break it down into three main resources: resources of nutrients, availability of water, and solar radiation, just light energy. So these three things I think of as the essential resources for crop growth. And it assumes that you have a really, really good cultivar that's adapted to your growing conditions and that does well in your environment. That's kind of the first thing. The whole assumption falls apart if you have a cultivar that's not adapted to your production system. I want to look at kind of just general responses to these resources that we can think about. And this is just looking at crop response, and you can think about this as yield or crop growth versus increasing resource availability. So you can think about this primarily as nutrients because we're all very familiar with crop responses to nutrients. And this would look very typical if you're looking at a corn response to nitrogen fertilization. You see this response where you have very low levels of nitrogen fertilizer. You add 1 unit of nitrogen fertilizer, you get a big jump in yield. And then for each unit of additional nitrogen that you apply, you get less and less response until you've reached some sort of plateau here where you get no further response. Now this is well characterized for all the nutrients. In essentially every crop that you can think of, we see this same kind of response to all the different nutrients that crops need. What's a little bit less clear is exactly how these responses for light and water are needed by the crop. In general, the scientific literature says that this, instead of looking like the nutrient response, is a straight line. That is that every unit of light energy that the crop is able to absorb, you get a corresponding increase in yield. Now for water, we know that's not exactly right. If you give a crop too much water, it is going to die, right? If it has wet feet season long. But if it is actually able to use that water through transpiration, through photosynthesis, then you'd expect to get this same kind of response. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. I do want to go back and think about what we've seen with light energy and how this may play out in this maximum yield kind of context. So I'm looking here, this is research that we've done over several years where we're looking at relative yield. And relative yield just means that for any given experiment, the highest yield we've gotten is 100%, or a relative yield of 1. And we're looking at this as the total amount of light energy intercepted from emergence until the crop begins to senesce. And we've used in this experiment a wide range of maturity groups, everything from double zeros all the way to maturity group 6 soybean. And so for these very early maturing double zero soybeans, we see that they have a very steep response, kind of like that nutrient response. A little bit of light energy gives them a whole bunch of yield. But at some point, we stop getting that yield response. And actually, this corresponds to about a maturity group 2 soybean. Once we reach that maturity group 2 soybean, we can add a lot more light energy, and we get really very little yield increase. And so if we're able to use that light energy efficiently, the most efficient part is this part of the slope. But once we've intercepted this much light energy for a maturity group 2 soybean all the way out to maturity group 6 soybean, we're not getting a whole lot of yield increase. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk and talk about how this relates to work that Mr. Cullors is doing on his farm, or how we think it is. So now I want to turn to Mr. Cullors' farm and talk about some of his production system and how he manages these resources. This is a shot of Mr. Cullors' production field, his contest field in 2008. It's located in southwest Missouri in Stark City. The soil is described as a Newtonia silt loam. This is a red soil. It's very, very deep. It's very well drained. There's no obvious root restriction. The roots just go down, I believe, from what we've seen. He's generally used Pioneer cultivars in his production system, and the stuff that we'll be talking about this morning, it'll be from a 4.7 all the way to a 5.9 in maturity. He generally will sow earlier than this. This was in April 28th. We had a very, very wet spring this year. He wasn't able to get to his field as soon as he wanted, but he would typically plant more like the April the 10th, April the 15th. He plants his crop, as you can see, in twin rows. These are 10-inch twins on 32-inch centers at a fairly high population of 220,000 seed per acre. So he likes to get his crop up, likes to get it growing and canopying quickly. He has a center pivot that he irrigates very frequently. He never likes to see his crop suffer. He fertilizes a lot with poultry litter, uses a large amount of poultry litter, and his center pivot's set up with a fertigation system so he can put out micronutrients, more nitrogen, anything he wants. He pumps a lot through that irrigation system. Finally, he does a really good job with pest control. He's a very good manager. He's in his field every day. He's looking for any problems that are obvious. With this much water that he applies to his field, this closed canopy, you can think that it's a very, very prime place where you get fungal diseases, and he applies fungicides very liberally. He also does a really good job with weed control and insect control. We've looked on his farm at how quickly the canopy closes, and this is just looking at the amount of the fraction of light intercepted, so that'd be 100% light interception versus day of the year. So what this shows is that we can actually, because this is a straight line, we can predict on any given day of the year how much light is being intercepted by the crop. We wanted to do this because we wanted to get some estimate of kind of the photosynthetic rate of his crop. We initially thought that the reason his yields might be so high out there was because his photosynthetic rate was much, much greater than other parts where soybean are grown. And the way that we've done this is we've gone in and harvested the above ground portion of the crop at different time points in the season and plotted it against the amount of light that's intercepted by the crop. And that represents kind of a long-term integrated measurement of photosynthesis. And what this shows is that this slope here is a long-term measure of that photosynthetic rate, and it's very similar to what other people have found for this type of measurement. In other words, he has a very well-managed crop, but it's similar in photosynthetic rates to what other people have found when you have a crop that's well-managed, plenty of nutrients, plenty of water. So that didn't seem to be the answer as to what's going really on with his crop as far as these high yields. We've also looked at seed growth characteristics. The way that we've done this is we've looked at the harvest index versus different time points during the season for these three different cultivars. And let me explain what this funny little graph means. The harvest index is simply, to measure this, we take about a meter of crop, meter squared of crop, or a yard of crop, yard squared. We dry it down, and then we shell out all the seeds in that crop. And then we weigh it, and the fraction of seed weight to total above ground weight is the harvest index. And we do this during the season while the crop's still growing, and then we do it at the end of the season. So this represents the in-season measurements for this harvest index increase. And if we can extend these lines all the way back down to the beginning of where it crosses where harvest index is 0, and that tells us when the seed fill period started. That's what we see here. So we have a seed fill period beginning for this cultivar on July 21st, July 27th, and August the 7th. And then if we know what the final harvest index is, we can show that there, and then we can determine the duration of the seed fill period from this point all the way to this point. So we do that with all these different cultivars, and what we find is we have a seed fill duration of about 37 days, 60 days, and 51 days for these different cultivars. The 37 days isn't very unusual. We think of most of our soybean varieties having seed fill duration periods of around 30 to 35 days. So this is fairly similar to what some of these other cultivars have, some of these other varieties. But 60 days and 51 days is a very, very long seed fill period. And we think that part of the reason for this is his early planting dates gives him a very, very early flowering date. His flowering period is an extremely long period. It's sometimes 7 to 8 weeks. And during this time period, seeds put on very slowly, and the duration of the seed fill period as a consequence is very, very long. We've also looked at the leaf nitrogen concentration. I'll talk a lot about the nitrogen importance in his production system, but we've looked at leaf nitrogen concentration, and we've plotted this here for these three different cultivars as the days when that harvest index began to increase, when the seed fill period first began. So anything with a negative number here is actually during vegetative growth. If we look at vegetative soybean, the leaf nitrogen concentration in the top uppermost leaf was around between 5 and 6%, which is relatively high, but really not too unusual. And then we see a steady decrease during the seed fill period. But what is unusual about this is that when you reach maturity, physiological maturity, you still have 3% nitrogen in the leaves. And this is very, very unusual. When you go out and look at Mr. Culler's field, the lights are up right now, but this field is at harvest moisture. It's at 13% moisture, and his field's completely green. To harvest this crop, he has to go in and desiccate. And that is something that's very unusual. He's ready to harvest. His seed's at 14% moisture, and there's so much leaf nitrogen, so much green out there he has to desiccate. And we feel like his nutritional program is something that's very, very unique on his farm. So just kind of summarize this part on his kind of management program. Some key things that we think are important here. He plants early. He also uses a lot of seed treatments to make sure his crop's not going to be subject to damping off or other seedling diseases. He does a really good job with variety selection. He has a small variety test on his farm every year, so he knows what does best on his farm. He's a very good manager. He's very conscious of pests and problems out there, and he addresses them promptly. He does a good job with water management. He irrigates frequently, and he's blessed with a very, very deep soil with good drainage. And he has a really high-intensity fertility program. And I don't know all the details of this program. He's been very generous with me. He's told me I can make any measurements on anything related to the plants, but to wipe my feet when I leave the field. So I can't tell you much more about his fertility program other than he fertigates a lot and he does use a lot of chicken litter. Okay, I want to turn now and talk a little bit about some modeling work that we've done using kind of the inputs from measurements that we've made at Mr. Culler's farm and what we think that this can tell us about some key aspects of what's going on in his farm. So this is kind of an academic thing here, but I want to describe the model a little bit so you'll have an appreciation that some of the measurements we've made actually can be used in this kind of an exercise. So during vegetative development, the model uses daily time steps using weather data that we've collected from very close to his farm. We are able to measure light interception each day, and then we predict light interception each day based upon the model parameters. This calculates the plant growth rate based upon the amount of light that's intercepted, and then the shoot nitrogen accumulates to meet whatever the crop needs, bounded by some maximum rate. During reproductive development, it's a little bit different. We have to put in certain inputs for the model. These include the dates when the linear harvest index began, when seed growth begins. That's an input that we give. It makes daily seed growth met by these. Daily seed growth is met by the current production of photosynthesis and nitrogen accumulation. But if the crop runs out of nitrogen and photosynthate sugars, it's during seed growth, it's supplied by breaking down the vegetative part of the plant and sending it to the seed. And then this use of nitrogen from the leaves and meeting seed growth causes the crop to senesce. And these last two parts are real critical. I'm going to come back, so if you're going to remember these last two parts. During seed growth, this model says that if it doesn't have enough nitrogen and enough sugars to develop the seed, that it breaks down the leaves to send to the seed. Okay. So, with that in mind, we're going to look at just some simulations of 1 year under these fully irrigated, high productive conditions at Mr. Culler's farm. And what I want to, so this is weather data taken from his farm in 2007. We're looking at yield here at bushels per acre. And I've got several different parameters here that are kind of like different scenarios that you can put into the model to predict yield. But what I want you to notice is all of these simulations have yields from 70 bushels per acre up to about 105 bushels per acre. In 2007, Mr. Culler's yield was 155 bushels per acre. So this model is way under predicting anything that Mr. Culler's, way under predicting the yields that Mr. Culler's actually achieved. We have one scenario here that actually comes pretty close, and this +0 means it actually predicted correctly the maturity date for his crop. It predicted that very well, and this number right here is the final harvest index, which is a reasonable number. But it's still only looking at about 80 bushels per acre, roughly a half of what Mr. Culler's got on his farm. So now we change the model, and we take away that assumption that the crop is unable, that the crop takes that leaf nitrogen and sends it to the seed. We assume that Mr. Culler's gives his crop so much nutrients that it never has to break down leaf proteins in order to supply the seed. And when we do that, we have a different scale here. We're looking at yield now, and we see that our lowest yield's about 140 bushels per acre, and it goes up almost to 200 bushels per acre. Now, some of these scenarios that the simulations run aren't exactly in line with what we've observed in the field, but the 155 bushel per acre yield, when this scenario right here is within 2 days of predicting the harvest or the maturity date, and this one within 1 day of the maturity date. So there are some scenarios that agree very well with his production system that are very close to the yields that he's obtained. And I think one of the key things here is this is assuming that the crop has unlimited nitrogen supply, that his fertility program results in a system that never has to use those vegetative proteins in the leaves to send to the seed. And this keeps the leaves green like we've seen at the end of the season. So, he has 14% moisture and a green crop out there. I mentioned Dr. Flannery at Rutgers University in 1980 to 1984. He did also some maximum yield research, and there were a lot of similarities to what Mr. Cullors is doing on his farm. I just want to run through some of those real quickly. He used high rates of manure application in his experiment, in this case dairy manure, supplying about 150 pounds of nitrogen, 100 pounds of P, 100 pounds of K, 40 pounds of S in the manure applications. He used narrow rows, high plant populations. He irrigated frequently. He also had a very well-drained soil. He was very liberal in his applications of fungicides because his whole environment, closed canopy, high moisture, high fertility is prime for fungal infections. And he fertilized his crop with nitrogen fertilizer up to 175 pounds per acre. This was a different time period. This was in the mid-1980s, early 1980s. He was using, I believe, an Asgrow 3.3 variety in this experiment. Yields have come a long way, of course, since the mid-1980s and what our absolute yield potential is. But this production system had yields of around 117, bushels per acre. So how much nitrogen is required to produce this 150 bushel per acre soybean crop? And we can just run through some numbers real quickly. If we say the soybean seed has about 40% protein, that's about 6.4% nitrogen. That means that the seed has 575 pounds of nitrogen in it. If we say the stover's 1% nitrogen, we can add about 90 to 100 pounds more nitrogen in the stover. If we apply 5 tons of chicken litter and it contains 3% nitrogen, we can supply around 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Not all of this would be available the first year because it would need to mineralize in order to be available to the crop. But if you're doing this over successive years, you could maybe estimate that 300 pounds of nitrogen might be available in any one given year. If the crop's irrigated from R1 to mid-R6 for about 12 weeks, 3 times per week, at 12.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you could supply about 450 pounds of nitrogen this way. So we're looking here at roughly 750 pounds of nitrogen during the growing season. Tremendous amount of nitrogen, of course. And this would supply the amount of nitrogen that we're talking to produce this crop. I'm not sure if this is what Kip Cullors is doing, but this is one way that you could supply this amount of nutrients without burning your crop up. That's certainly a lot of nutrients to apply. I want to run real briefly now through some maximum yield research that we've done at the University of Arkansas. And I don't want to disappoint you, so I'll go ahead and tell you up front, we've not been able to get Kip Cullors yields, but we have learned a lot. And we're implementing some practices now that we think are going to get us closer and closer. Mr. Cullors has agreed to have us come back on his farm for the next 3 years. I've got a graduate student that's going to be doing his PhD, working with Mr. Cullors and doing some research here on the farm that we're really excited about. So this experiment has been done in Fayetteville. We're about 90 miles from Mr. Cullors' farm. So the environment, the weather conditions are very similar to what he has. We've used some of the same Pioneer cultivars that Mr. Cullors has used on his farm in his contest field. Our seeding rate's fairly similar, 200,000 seed per acre. We don't have a twin row planter, but we've adjusted this to use just a 20-inch, put everything on 20-inch rows. Our treatments have basically been irrigation, where we're looking at watering at a half-inch or a 1-inch deficit, very frequent irrigation, small amounts. We're looking at fungicide applications of Folacure plus Headline at R2 and R5, or R2 plus every 10 days after that. And we've looked at chicken litter applications, 4 tons of chicken litter per acre, and then plus fertigation, where we're applying about 10 pounds of nitrogen in the irrigation water as urea ammonium nitrate with every irrigation during reproductive development. So just a quick summary, we're looking at yields in bushels per acre here for our different varieties and then our different fungicide treatments. We've got, the biggest difference here is the differences in the variety response. The one variety that we had that did very, very well with this R2 and R5 treatment had 98 bushels per acre. This was the most significant thing in this whole project, but I think that what's important here is that these were very, very tight data for this one data set, for this one mean value here. All the values that we had here were between 106 and 92 bushels per acre. So a very tight group of data that went into this one bar here. But we're still a long ways off from 160 bushels per acre. What resources are needed for these extraordinary yields? And I want to return back to a graph that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. This is from research that we've done in years past, and we've repeated this in several different environments where we're looking at relative yield. This would be 100% in any one given experiment versus the total amount of light energy intercepted. And remember, light energy is one of those things that we can think about as an essential resource for crop growth. And at some point in all the research I've ever done, we've reached a point where we add more light energy intercepted and we never get a yield response. I think what Mr. Colors has done is he's absolutely eliminated all other limitations to yield except light, and he's straightened this response out. His yield is limited now primarily by how much light he can intercept during the growing season, and he's been able to do that by having a very, very aggressive management program that eliminates pests and a very aggressive nutrient management program that eliminates any kind of nutrient want by the crop. Okay, some final thoughts in the way of summary here. Crop growth and yields depends upon these resources that I've talked about: nutrients, water, and light energy, solar radiation. When any of these resources are limiting, other resources become non-limiting. Maximum yield in a given environment may ultimately be limited by the amount of light intercepted, and I think that's the case with Mr. Colors' farm. He's eliminated all these other type of biotic effects, abiotic effects, and nutrient limitations. And finally, for soybean, unless there's some really intensive management system that's going to change things, from what we've seen based upon the crop growth modeling work, it's going to be very, very difficult to go over this 95 to 105 bushel per acre limit unless the crop's fertilized and managed very, very intensively. And with that, I'll close, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to address those. The question was, do I have any idea how much chicken litter Mr. Colors is actually putting on his farm? He does this every year. He applies chicken litter, and I don't know exactly how much he's putting on. I've showed him kind of the back of the napkin estimates I've had for how much nitrogen needs to be put out, and he's more or less said, well, you're not too far off. But he's, as you can imagine, he's very, very concerned about regulators coming in and looking at his farm and being concerned about it. I think, no, I don't know. I don't know how much he's putting out. The question is there any economic analysis that goes along with producing 160 bushel per acre yield? No, and he'll be the first one to tell you that he could care less about the economics. This is his hobby. This is what he does for fun. He's challenging himself. He's actually implementing a lot of these practices on his production fields. In 2009, his contest field, where he implements all these kind of production practices, had severe disease problem. No, 2008. Well, 2008 and through 2009. But 2008, his production field had a lot of disease problems, and he went to one of his production fields and actually cut his contest there. His contest in that year, his yield in that year was 118 bushels per acre. I was in the combine when he cut it, and the yield monitor never dropped below 105 on a production field. So he's not concerned in his contest field about the bottom line. He's just saying this is what the maximum yield could be. There was a question over here. That's a real good question. The question was, what's going on below ground in his crop? I've talked about the above ground part. I haven't made extensive measurements below ground. I have looked at nodulation. I have looked a little bit at nitrogen fixation in his crop. Surprisingly, even with all this nitrogen that's out there, he still has very good nodulation. He still has very active nodules. I've estimated, based upon some chemical kind of analysis, that roughly 40% of his nitrogen is actually coming from nitrogen fixation, which is very surprising. We've looked a little bit at rooting depth, and this is just very observational, no kind of statistical analysis. His roots are very deep. I've dug roots up. They're very well developed. You see no limitation vertically going down. Yes, sir.
Well, I guess, first of all, what Mr. Stovall said is going to be very, very important to me. It's a term we don't use much anymore called maximum economic yield.
Right.
At some point, that would be extremely interesting to see where the point of diminishing returns is with yield versus how much money per acre gets made or spent. The other thing, your comment about 95 to 105, if you're going to get there, you have to intensively manage. I guess what I'm asking is that, we have a lot of people in Arkansas that are doing what they consider to be intensive management, and if we yield between 65 and 80, we're thrilled.
Yes.
Okay, that's tremendous. 75 means is I'm not saying there's never any higher, but that's pretty amazing. I guess my curiosity would be, how much difference is there between what the verification program and University of Arkansas research has shown to be a top soybean management program, which is not giving us 95 to 105, except in a rare occasion? How much of a gap is there, either in fertility or?
Well, another great question, and I'm not sure I can fully address it. Even to get 95 to 100 bushels per acre, I think is still going to be very, very unusual. I think it requires alignment of the stars, to be in the right soil, to have very good drainage, to be able to get in the field early in the spring to get your crop planted, which you can't do every year, of course. It's going to take a nutrient management program that ensures that you're getting everything that crop needs. I think the fertility management is something that we kind of have a mindset that we really need to put a pencil to what the nutrients are we're removing from the soil when we're having yields that are 75, 80 bushels. It's not the same as when we were cutting 50 bushels per acre, and we really need to be aware of that, how much nutrients we're removing from the soil and what we can do to make sure that crop is not hurting. And it's not just for nitrogen either. The research or the work that Kip's doing on his farm, I don't think is necessarily the way anybody will want to do for their own farm. But some of the practices that I think that we can learn from him are that he is a very good manager. He's very aware of the nutrients that are in his crop, in his soil, and how much he's taken off each year. And he wants to make sure that that's never a limitation. I think still it comes back to having the ideal environment, the ideal rotation, what your crop is, what crop preceded your soybean crop, and just having all of these different factors line up. I'm not sure I did a very good job of answering your question, but the point is, even to get 95 to 100 bushel yield, or from going from 65 to 80 bushels, I think still requires a lot of things just falling into exact place. Yes, sir. That's a good question. At what yield level would I expect nitrogen to be limiting? Based upon what we've seen in the crop model, and I think this goes pretty much with what some producers in the very best conditions have found, is that it's somewhere probably around 80, 85 bushels per acre. That under best conditions, soybeans can provide enough nitrogen to meet that 85 or so bushel per acre yield level. The question is, does Mr. Colors rotate with corn? Yes. It's 1 year, 1 year. He actually wins corn contests regularly, and he'll tell you that's his first love. Yeah, Brad. The question was if I've seen some of the same lodging, large leaf things Mr. Colors experiences on his farm in our experiments. And yes, when we've had very high yielding, under these high yielding conditions, yeah, we see the same thing, that Mr. Colors farm's a tangled mess, a lot of lodging, and we see the same thing in our small plot work too. Laney. Do I think he could obtain those yields with surface applied irrigation? That's a real good question. I don't know. The fertigation ability gives him a lot of flexibility, and he's not only applying nitrogen. I know he's applying potassium as well. He applies micronutrients as well. So it's a whole suite of things that is allowing him to manage his nutrients that are pretty unique. Yeah. Thank you.